Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the online launch of the Farmer's Guide for the production, use and application of biochar. I'm Don Coyne, the CEO of ANZBIG, and this webinar will run for 1.5 hours with a 15-minute introduction, 25 minutes from each presenter, and finishing with a Q&A session. You can type your questions in the Q&A panel, and please have a chat in the chat prompt. The guide is now available to buy at $35 Australian for non-members and free to members by logging into your profile at anzbig.org. A high-resolution copy is also available on request. A massive thanks to the authors Paul Taylor and Stephen Joseph, who have put in a planet-saving type effort to produce this world-class reference guide. We've had approximately 200 downloads since late March from all over the world on the draft review for comment, and we encourage those people to now purchase the guide or join ANZBIG. We would also like to thank our funders and supporters of the guide, which are listed on the front cover: Metamorph Engineering, Rainbow Bee Eater, Waste Psychology, Regenerative Ag Alliance at the Southern Cross Uni, Earthbank, and the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation at the Department of Primary Industries for Western Australia under their Healthy Estuaries program. The front cover photo there is of Sharla Hosini Bay in the foreground and Nagar Omdavar in the background. And the photo is credited by Dr. Michael Farrer. First up, acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and work throughout Australia, New Zealand, and the surrounding islands. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, traditions, cultures, and hopes of Indigenous Australia and New Zealand. As we engage in our work to advance the biochar industry, we recognise the deep connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have with the land and their unique contributions to sustainable land management practices. We honour their custodianship, resilience, and wisdom, and may we continue to learn from and guided by the knowledge and expertise of Indigenous peoples as we strive for a sustainable future. I would now like to hand over to our chair, Melissa Rebick at Metamorph Engineering, to give the opening address. So over to you, Melissa.
Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. Does that come up?
Yes.
Great. The biochar movement's here, everybody. Thank you for coming online. Don's going to go into more detail. I'll only be with you for a minute or so. I just wanted to reiterate both the thank you on the Farmer's Guide and the reasons why we need this. Firstly, ANZBIG, which Don's going to go into more detail of, is, we aim to be $1 billion industry by 2030. By coming on board with ANZBIG and being part of, donating to our crowdfund, you're investing in your future and your children's future. Our industry can turn 50 million metric tonnes minimum of waste that's available in minimum of waste in Australia at the moment to biochar. The biochar value alone, if it's valued at $500 per metric tonne, is $5 to $7.5 billion per annum. The carbon dioxide removal by turning that waste to biochar, so we actually call it biochar carbon removal, is worth a minimum of $3 billion per annum. The agricultural productivity gains, if we're just talking a 3% increase in agricultural productivity, based on 70 billion in GDP at the moment, is a minimum 2 billion, but Stephen's Stephen's references show that it can increase by up to 42%, so that's minimum. Renewable energy savings based on 300 million gigajoules of energy from that waste is worth a minimum of 16.5 million per annum. The soil carbon growth value alone, just by applying biochar to the soil, is 90 million per annum, and that's the carbon increase, not accounting for carbon in the biochar, and a 32 million per annum in water savings minimum. These are just some of the values for agriculture, not to mention the savings in fertiliser and the like, to a $12.5 billion per annum potential. The whole biochar movement has grown by 91%. In the last 2 years. We are here, we are growing, our technology is here, and it is extraordinarily timely, and we are incredibly grateful to Stephen and Professor Stephen Joseph and Dr. Paul Taylor for this incredible publication. I admit initially I wasn't sure why this was needed, and now I've seen the publication, I totally understand. I've utilised some of the information already in discussions. It is absolutely globally impactful resource, and that will support responsible use and implementation of biochar nationally and globally, including the case studies, the soil benefits it talks about, the testing, the properties of biochar, the technology that's arrived, and much, much more. Thank you again to all of our contributors, and looking forward to hearing more from Don and, importantly, Professor Joseph and Paul. Thank you. So that's it from me, and I'll hand it back to you, Don.
Thank you, Melissa. Just share my screen. So just some further acknowledgements. We had 2 interns from Monash University, Pia Vassallo and Rosie Burke, who worked with us on the, Paul, if you could turn your video off, please, worked with us on the development of the drafts. We are indebted to Janet Bishop for editorial assistance, and Karen Enkelar as well did some editorial. Many friends have reviewed the draft and given valuable feedback. A group of researchers and practitioners in Brazil provided valuable input into the case studies. A draft was sent out for peer review to academics, farmers and biochar practitioners. And also acknowledgement of our graphic artist, Rosie Moulton from the biochar Byron Shire, where this all started. So about the Farmer's Guide, the quote on our landing page on the website, the potential of biochar to improve crop yields, increase resistance to plant disease, remove toxic substances from soil, and sequester carbon is well documented. Biochar is biomass that has undergone thermal decomposition in an oxygen-starved environment. Extensive experimentation has shown that biochars from different feedstocks and different temperatures can have different effects on different plants in different soils, climates and ecosystems. There is growing recognition that biochars and biochar-based amendments and fertilisers must be strategically chosen or enhanced to help overcome soil environmental constraints. The guide is divided into 11 chapters, starting with principles of biomass pyrolysis for biochar production. It covers the indigenous practices, choosing a biochar unit, properties of fresh biochars and wood vinegar, properties of biochar change, effects of biochar on crop production and soil properties, how to choose and enhance biochars to meet specific soil constraints, methods of applying biochar, case studies, biochar in regenerative agriculture and carbon drawdown, and the testing of biochars. I want to now, I'd like to now officially launch also today on formally launched the Kickstart crowdsource fund for the roadmap implementation in the 24-25 financial period, which includes funding for the sequel of the guide, a farmer's manual, which will have step-by-step instructions on how to produce, use, and apply biochar. If you think the guide is good, wait until you read the manual. It will be super practical and helpful to farmers and other practitioners. You can visit our crowdsource fund campaign, which I'll put in the chat at chuffed.org. Speaking of which, I am very chuffed to announce that on day one of this public campaign, we have already hit the first milestone of 100,000 towards our target of 300,000. Industry supporters include our transformational supporters of Stephen Joseph himself, Rainbow Beta, Waste Psychology, and Metamorph Engineering. Also, a big thanks to Impact supporters Catalyst Environmental Management and KSI Sawmills. For a full list of contributors, you can visit the link that I'll put in the chat and donate now. So to become a biochar industry 2030 roadmap Kickstart supporter, we're looking for Kickstart supporters to boost ANZBIG's capacity to implement our roadmap for the coming 24-25 financial year. Our target is 300,000 in 90 days, or 10% of our expected annual budget to help facilitation of the implementation of the roadmap. Are you a private company or government body in the carbon drawdown sector wanting to achieve net zero by 2030 to 2050? Please join us and become part of the solution to help create a new carbon economy in your region. So by participating in the crowdfund, you'll get brand visibility, consumer perception, targeted marketing, community goodwill, and advocacy and representation. Concurrent examples of that include the proposed development of an ACCU method specifically for carbon removal. So be part of an unlocking a thriving biochar future in Australia by kickstarting ANZBIG's growth. To achieve our region's annual industry potential of 15 million tonnes of biochar production per annum, 37.5 million tonnes of CO2 sequestration per annum. It's $1 billion industry value and 10,000 total employment. We're going to progress 14 of 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. ANZBIG has established 6 volunteer working groups to deliver 10 initiatives, including resourcing, education, communications, policy and regulations, innovation, supply, market development, and standards and certification. Our volunteers are progressing their group's aims. However, ANZBIG has to adequately resource the roadmap implementation to help them scale up, and will require an annual budget of 3 million Australian to fully support the industry as it grows. The resourcing group is growing multiple funding streams, from improved membership offerings and annual conferences to government grants and philanthropic donations to enable ANZBIG and the emerging industry to scale up. This funding campaign is a kickstart for the implementation of the roadmap while these other funding mechanisms mature to sustain the organisation. So your investment in this fund will boost the implementation of the initiatives in the 24-25 period. It will build momentum and catalyse the larger ongoing funding streams required to unlock a biochar thriving future. That's our timeline. So the initiation is today. We'll have various extension activities online. We've got a co-hosted webinar with the International Biochar Initiative scheduled for early August, and then we'll have a final call webinar in late September. That's our core activities. So organisational growth and governance, education and communications, policy and regulations. For example, there's been in ACT a ban on all thermal treatment of waste. So the decoupling of pyrolysis and gasification policy position statement we intend to publish aims to assist removal of that. We also need to advocate for appropriate revision of state policies, such as the draft of the Queensland End of Waste Code for biochar. This all requires funding. So you can show your support by 3 ways. You can become a member if you're not already. You can contribute to this crowdfund campaign, and you can do that as a corporate or institution or as part of the community. And then you can partner with us as ANSPIC. There's the corporate and institutional support. So the transformative supporter is from 20,000 plus, and we've got 3 of those already. There's the influential supporter level, which is 10,000 to 20,000, or the impact supporter from 2,500 to 10,000. So the community support, you can help us deliver climate, social and economic benefits of biochar across Australia and New Zealand. Kickstart our crowdfund as a member of the biochar community and be listed as an anonymous donor, or add your name to the donation. You will be contributing to the new carbon economy, transitioning towards renewable sources of energy and carbon. So join ANSPIC during this 90-day campaign and be part of this Kickstart crowdsource funding campaign. You can visit our member benefits and details page for more information and sign up today. There's my contact details if you'd like to get in touch to discuss some details in finer detail. So thank you. All right, so head on over to the crowdfund page. Now, I'd like to now hand over to our 2 presenters today, Paul Taylor. So Paul is the editor of the Biochar Revolution. He graduated with the University Medal in Physics from the University of New South Wales, received a PhD from University of Colorado, and worked at Harvard Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory and MIT. He now lives in both Australia and the US, researching and presenting on biochar and climate change. And then followed by Paul will be Stephen Joseph. Stephen graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Metallurgic Engineering and a PhD in Architecture and Anthropology from the University of New South Wales. He is Fellow of the Institute of Energy and was awarded an Order of Australia for his work in renewable energy and biochar. He was CEO of a renewable energy company and then a biochar fertiliser company. And he has been a visiting professor and consultant to the biochar industry and research community. He has written over 160 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters for the past 14 years. So I'm now going to hand over to you, Paul, to share your screen and run through your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for sitting that out.
Do I need my video off, Don?
No, you keep that on.
Of course, okay. So let's see how we do. We should pop up with a slideshow.
That's it, and whack it in slideshow. That's
okay.
it.
Let me get rid of all this in the way. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon. Very happy to be here. It's come out of working with Stephen over all those years and Don actually writing the guide has brought me back into biochar after a bit of a hiatus. I introduced this slide. It's like jumping into deep end. You hear me? Oh, well, okay, right? It's like jumping in the deep end.
Yes, we do.
But I want to share what got me here. And what got me here was 50 years of interest in climate change from the early days in Colorado, working next to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where they published a paper every week on climate change in the 70s. So I just want to put this, I can deal with details, but I also can really quite like to start with a meta level. And the big level is we're putting a $10 billion pulse of carbon up into the atmosphere every year, and that carbon decays on a timeline, which is really a combination of exponentials. But you could see here that it's decaying about 50% within 50 years. And then it continues to decay with a longer tail, so that we still have 40% at the end of 100 years and nearly 20% at the end of 1,000 years, and it just keeps going out. And every pulse we put up every year, every 10 billion tons of carbon sits on top of that. Now, why am I telling you that? Well, it's because it's not the whole story. That carbon's partitioning between the atmosphere and the land biome and the ocean. And this is showing how that partitioning occurs. You put your pulse of 250, I'm going with 250 billion ton pulse here for a reason. That's just 25 years of carbon emissions. That's nothing in terms of time on a geological scale. That's almost like an instantaneous pulse. Well, you put that pulse up and some of it goes into the ocean, decays into the ocean, and some decays into the land. It all decays into the biosphere. But what happens when you put such a big pulse up, this is a series of logarithmic scales, is that it begins to cause a pulse of carbon to emerge out of the lithosphere. And that's quite a lot of extra carbon that comes into the biosphere. And it takes about 70,000 years to correct that before we can begin to correct the actual original pulse, which is 250 billion tons that we put up. So an extra 150 billion tons come out of the lithosphere by various processes, because that big pulse puts so much pressure on the system that it caused that to happen. Now, the second thing is this, I want to emphasize is that when you do a negative pulse, when you draw a pulse of carbon out of the atmosphere, that withdrawal from the atmosphere also decays by exactly the same exponential curve. So after 50 years, half the carbon has come back out of the ocean, right? It doesn't stay out of the atmosphere. The ocean and the atmosphere are connected. The whole biosphere is. So when you put a withdrawal pulse, the decay curves and the partitioning are like this. This red curve here shows that carbon is coming out of the plant sphere quicker than it went into it. So that's even worse for us. So every time we put up a pulse and then make a withdrawal, it's actually coming right back out of the ocean, the plants back into the atmosphere. So the essential point is that we have to withdraw at least 10 billion tons of biochar out of the biosphere. It's not out of the atmosphere. It comes out of the atmosphere initially, but then it comes back out of the ocean. So we're really sequestering carbon from the ocean into the soil by using biochar. That's why I produced the biochar revolution in 2010. That plus the fact that biochar regenerates the soil and regenerates the planet, and you can visualize a green earth. And so biochar plays a role in that regeneration of both the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land. So, since my interest in all of this, since I did the biochar revolution in 2010, there's been a massive amount of publications on biochar. This is the number of publications. There's a total of 34,000 publications. So a lot of knowledge needs to be translated into wisdom. And that's why I started with the climate. We have not done a good job, including the scientists, of translating all of that science into wisdom, into practice. Well, this this curve here, which is a straight line, if we continue that for just 9 more years, or 9.5 more years, we're going to have another 34,000 publications. So we need a way to translate all of that knowledge into practice. Now, we know that biochar is produced by the interaction of sunlight with carbon dioxide and water and minerals through photosynthesis and producing plant matter. We can carbonize that, pyrolyze that, and produce biochar. And we can put some of the biochar back into the soil to get more biomass. But lots of other things that biochar does, indicated here. And these things, about half the publications are related to putting biochar into the soil, and the other half, and growing bigger, is all these other practices of biochar. And the hot topics emerging from a bibliometric analysis are toxic metal immobilization and catalysts for biochar production. So we're only going to talk about soil mostly, perhaps water remediation with the farmers, perhaps cleaning up heavy metals, but a lot more is going on as well. So oh, I don't like that. There's something sitting on top of my screen. Okay, so what I wanted to do here was just mention the problem we face. There's lots of academic research on biochar. It's absolutely prolific, yet it's not being used at large scale. Farmers are unaware of or skeptical about its effects. There is limited evidence of its economical sustainability compared to fertilizers. And the problem is that we're not doing a very good job of dealing with the cost factors, the sustainability factors of using biochar. The biochars are very case specific, depending on many factors like location, feedstock scale, pyrolysis conditions, the price, the crop being cultivated, potential internalization of externalities, and all of this hampers private investment. Those factors must be considered carefully and dealt with for each individual case. And the studies often do not, the scientific studies often do not include external costs and benefits. And when they do, they're often dealing with external benefits rather than costs. And even when they do that, it's often related to carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions, and drawdown. And that's because there's money there, there's carbon trading. So the inclusion of all these externalities in the economic assessments is necessary to provide a solid arguments to develop policies for the acceleration of market uptake of biochar technology. So that's what we want to do with the manual, and what we've done to some extent with the guide is to consider all these factors and try to make a persuasive argument to inspire people to do biochar. Now, we've already mentioned the contents, Don's done that, but I want to say here that it's divided into 3 sections in a sense, but we got it written. The initial section is about the concepts and practices, indigenous practices, and choosing a biochar unit that meets your needs. It's about production. The middle part of the guide is about science. Okay, the basic properties, the changes that occur when you introduce them to the soil, the effects of biochar on crop production and soils, and choosing and enhancing biochars and methods for applying biochars. I guess we're getting a bit more into practical. I got that wrong. 4 to 7 is the science, and 5 to 11 is more about the practice, the methods of applying biochar, the case studies, biochar and regeneration, and simple biochar testing on the farm. And in that section is where we have more of the case studies. So people might want to read the guide by reading some of the first chapters, jumping over to chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, and then coming back to the science when you're inspired to do so and when you need it. We've already dealt with the introductions, but I do want to also acknowledge indigenous cultures around the world, because I don't think we can solve the climate problem without really respecting indigenous cultures as absolute equals with us. And making as many amends to them as we can, because they're going to be a big help in solving it. That's number 1. Number 2, We colonize them, we're colonizing the atmosphere, we're colonizing the oceans. It's all the same thing that we're doing. We have to come out of it. So I'm going to go on now and do the example from each chapter, but I'm not going to really be trying to pull all the knowledge out and express that. I really want to give a sense of how we did the guide, why we're doing it, what type of efforts gone into it to translate the science into practice. So this is an example in the first chapter where we're looking at, I'd like to get something up the top of my screen, one moment. I can't do it. So this is just a simple thing of looking at the penetration of heat into the center of a piece of wood, because it takes time, right? And so if you put too big a chunk in the kiln, don't leave enough time, then it won't all be pyrolyzed. Now you can go to the literature and get something like what we have on the left here and try to translate that into something useful for yourself. But first of all, it's done on a Kelvin scale. So it starts at 300 degrees. I've done certain constructions on here to be able to get what I want out of it. But of course, that's about 27 degrees. And so and these are curves for different size and shapes particles. And this is a curve for the rate, the temperature rise in the center of the particle. So that translates into this, which is in the guide. When you pyrolyze a particle of biomass, it's all the different stages of pyrolysis, the drying, the torrefaction, the charring, all occurring at once. And the temperature is penetrating in like this, slower for large cubic particles, faster for smaller particles or particles that are round. And these are the stages of pyrolysis there. So we've got lots of figures. We've done our best to make them interesting and useful, but you have to look at them and read the caption. It's part of the manual. Coming out of that, comes a figure like this, because those graphs that you just saw can be converted into an equation by best fit of how long it takes heat to penetrate the center of the particle. And that is what this graph is not just thrown together, it's a graph that expresses that information. So each of these curves corresponds to how long it's actually measured to take heat to penetrate into a biomass. And pyrolysis can only occur when the time and temperature is above this curve. Below that curve, you get torrefaction, but you don't get pyrolysis. And depending on the size of the particle, you get to that place quicker and quicker. Now I'm moving on to chapter 2. Stephen's going to talk about chapter 2, but I just want to again emphasize the type of diagram we have in here. In Vietnam, households soak their bamboo or wood in a pond at the bottom of the rice fields. That pond is full of nutrients and sludge, and that gets embedded inside the biochar, and that actually makes inside the biomass, and that makes the biomass, the bamboo or the wood, burn more slowly, more cleanly, with lower emissions. Okay, and it also, as a consequence of that, produces a mineral-rich biochar and an increased yield of that mineral-rich biochar. And this type of drawing, which you'll see a lot in the slide, that's a electron micrograph of material inside there, showing the deposits and plaques of clay and minerals onto the biochar and into the pores of the biochar. And this is an X-ray spectrum that shows those minerals and the quantities of the minerals. So you'll see a lot of stuff like that in there. We're going into chapter 3 now. Chapter 3 is about how to choose a biochar reactor. And this is not for you to get into this total thing. It's just to say we've put some work into categorizing biochar reactors. One way to categorize them is by the type of reactor, the type of feedstock they can deal with, the emissions that you get out of them, the amount of heat and electricity you get out, the ease of use, and the estimated cost and lifetime. That's all in the guide for you to look at. But a second way we categorize is by whether they're internal heating or external heating. All of them can be. Internal heating is flaming pyrolysis like Kon-Tiki. External heating is retorts, whether it's oxic or anoxic, with or without oxygen pyrolysis, whether it's stoves, which is small scale and designed for heating some external environment like a cooking, or kilns, which are essentially ovens designed to heat what's inside them, that is the biomass, whether they're batch or continuous, whether they're fixed or mobile, whether they're chunky or fine feedstocks. And we enlarge on each of those points in a table there. These things all relate. For example, if it's a batch pyrolyzer, it can handle chunky feedstock. If it's it could probably handle both to some extent, but prefers, or at least things like the Kon-Tiki prefer chunky feedstock. But if it's a continuous pyrolyzer, it's going to like fine feedstock. This is just a presentation. This chapter goes on after the categorization into do-it-yourself type of biochar kilns, ones you can build or somebody else can build for you. And then the last part of the chapter is the commercial part, which is another following part of that, which is principles of design. But this represents the first part of the chapter, the do-it-yourself with the Kon-Tiki and many other types present there, trying and explaining how they work. And then the rest of the slide represents the commercial machines, democratic. They're just all here. I'm not going to say anything about them. Stephen will go into that a little bit, or you'll find it in the guide. But all these machines are available in Australia. And we go into, in many cases, how they work and what type of, what their operating parameters are. So this is the properties chapter. This is translating the science into something we can appreciate for the for properties of biochar. Stephen's going to address all of this. I just want to deal with one thing, just one section of it, which is cation exchange capacity. The cation exchange capacity is decreasing monotonically with increasing temperature, exactly the same way that the functional groups, the carboxylic, lactone, and phenolic functional groups are decreasing. Now, those functional groups are chemicals, molecules that attach to the surface of the biochar, sometimes metals embedded in the surface and ions embedded in the surface of the biochar, and they have this capacity to attract metal anions and cations to the surface of the biochar. Well, there's more of those when you produce a biochar with lower temperature, and so you get more cation exchange capacity generally with lower temperature. It's hard to make rules for biochar, by the way, lots of variation. But if you actually measure the absorption capacity of heavy metals, and we've done that here for chromium and mercury and lead, again, you see generally decreasing with temperature, with, of course, exceptions. So this is lead here, and this is lead here, and we get more absorption for lead in this study at higher temperature, but often it's decreasing with temperature, reflecting a lot of the mechanism for attracting heavy metals as the cation, as these functional groups, and there's more of those at lower temperature. One section in here I just wanted to draw attention to was the electrical properties of biochar. I've come to realize, and we're all coming to realize, that these are a very prominent part of how biochar works. And so this chapter defines the redox potential, defines the electron storage capacity, which is the total releasable electrons stored in the biochar. Redox potential depends on the tendency to acquire and release electrons, and the biochar can store electrons and release them. And in fact, it can be 1 billion trillion electrons, a millimole, so several millimoles of electrons can be stored within the structure of the biochar. And the biochar has the capacity to exchange those electrons. And that exchange is composed of two parts, the electron acceptor capacity and the electron donor capacity, the accepting and the donating of electrons. Now, poise, which is something a lot of people won't know about, is biochar's resistance to change in redox potential, right? So it's similar to the pH buffer capacity in soils, okay? Or what you do in your spa to buffer the pH by adding bicarbonate. So the electron activity is like pH. It's a measure of the flow of electrons. It's not a logarithmic scale for the hydrogen ions, but it's logarithmic scale for the flow of electrons. Now, all these things are related, and these properties, parallel chemical properties like pH and buffering, and the total nutrient content, and the nutrient availability, and the anion and cation exchange capacities. You see how those kind of might be related, and of course, they actually play a role in how those chemical properties work. In fact, one of the publications said that the electron exchange capacity should be a design parameter for biochar applications that involve redox transformation. Stephen's going to talk to this. I just wanted to say that this is just an illustration that the biochar does have electric properties. You put it in the soil, it can act like a battery. Voltage is created across the interface, and the voltage builds slowly over time. Now, we're moving on to chapter 5. I've left out because Stephen's going to address that, and I'm just really trying to address some of the way we did things. This is chapter 6, effects of biochar on crop production and soils. And in this chapter, we actually do a lot of meta-analysis. So at the end of the chapter, we explain what a meta-analysis is. And it's probably a good place to go and understand that, because there's a lot of data in there, there's a lot of diagrams, and you need to understand what it really all means. So a meta-analysis is systematic analysis and synthesis of data from large numbers of studies to produce higher evidence levels. And the outcome is bio's impact on soil properties and crop yields across different contexts. So it varies across contexts. We need to understand how it varies to be able to design better biochars. The process is you identify relevant studies of suitable qualities, extract the data, and use statistical techniques to analyze the results. And so they're often presented in graphs with 95% confidence limits. So we need to understand what all that means. The results presentation is here in forest, typically in forest plots. This is a forest plot over here. We'll go to that. And then the insight reveals when and where the biochar is most effective, guiding optimal biochar design and application. Now, this is a typical forest plot, and a lot of data in there, and even more in the actual publication. And doesn't have all this color like this, so it just looks like a bunch of grass spread on the page, really. It's why it's called a forest plot. It looks like a bunch of, looking down a bunch of trees. But what we've done, sorry, I skipped out of there, and I got to get back to it. And my machine's not operating the way I'd like it to. Yeah, we got back to it. So what I did here was divide this up and by moving the data around and coloring it. So we deal with biochar's effects on crops, biochar's how you manage the biochar. This is looking at the yield effect. It's a yield effect on crops. It's a yield effect depending on how you manage the biochar, the feedstock, the treatment temperature, the rate of application, how much nitrogen you're applying with it. Also, by the properties of the soil that you apply the biochar into and the climate. Now, just ignore the red dots for a moment. Just look at the blue dots. The blue dots represent the yield. For example, we find in maize, for crops, we got the highest yield across all the studies in maize. And this is like 60 different studies with a couple of hundred different types of trials in there across different crops and different everything. So, and down here is the change in yield. So there's an average change in yield ranging from 50 to 150% in the application, but in the best case in crops. If you look at feedstock, we found cereal residues are the best. If you look at treatment temperatures, the lower treatment temperatures are the best. If you look at the biochar rate, well, the low rates turn out to be better. And it turns out nitrogen is quite important to get the right amount of nitrogen and other nutrients with your biochar. And what we've done is presented our key point takeaway from all of that science in the same table. So you can read that, help you understand and draw attention to what's going on here. When you look at the soil properties, biochar works best in low pH soils that are poor soils, leach soils, sandy textures with low CECs, and it works best when it's got low organic carbon already. So the soil is greatly compromised, and that's where biochar works best. And then biochar works best in tropical and subtropical climates. And so what I want you to appreciate out of this when you present all these meta-analysis data, and we get a yield effect of, say, 20% across all the studies, all the soil types, all the types of biochar, all the climate zones, is that if we start to design the biochar and apply it for the best crops, the best kind of biochar, into the best soils, and the best climate zones, we get much more greater yield than the average yield across all these studies. It's important to realize that. Okay.
Well, we might need to about 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go quickly now. This just represents ways that we constructed charts so that you can really easily see which type. This is co-application of wood vinegar and biochar, and you can quickly look and see where biochar works best, where wood vinegar and biochar just exceeds everything else. Won't say much about this. It's another way of translating the science. We're trying to make this so it's really easy to understand that you can divide soil into 4 types. The soils generally lie somewhere inside this in terms of pH and EH. There's a most favorable zone, and biochar can begin to take you towards that favorable zone, but if you put too much, it can begin to take you out of it again. This one here is a favorite study of mine done at Wollongbar. This is the original data. This is the way we presented it. What we're doing is adding 5.7 tons of carbon into pasture, and it's growing soil organic carbon. It ends up with being 15 tons in there. Well, it's 50 tons per hectare in there. And actually, I'm going to have to look at this to understand. Oh, it's gone from 35 to 50. So it's put in 9.3 tons of soil organic carbon. The total was 15 extra growth. And so we actually nearly tripled the amount of carbon that was added with the biochar due to the way the biochar affects the soil and the microorganisms and bonds onto the carbon and makes it more durable in the soil. And if you put another bunch of carbon in, this whole process will kick in again. So we're showing here the ability that we can increase the saturation levels of soil organic carbon over time by each biochar application. Now that data then translates into something like this, where we just now did that every year. And you can see that if it was just compost, it just decays away. You don't have much at the end of 10 years. If it's a biochar increment, it decays a little bit. Each one's decaying a little bit. And you end up with a lot more, maybe 7 times as much. But because of the buildup of soil organic carbon, you end up with much more. So we get 10 times as much carbon from adding biochar as adding just compost to soil when you take into account all the dynamics that are going on. We're up to chapter 8. I won't go into this. The main thing I'm showing here is each chapter is constructed, so we have a bunch of key points at the very front. And in these later chapters, we provide the guidelines and the methods for application, and then we go into case studies. When we go to a special chapter we have on case studies, I'm only bringing this chart not for you to take in, just to show that We synthesize all those case studies, and you can see them across the top in cattle and beef lot feed, in horticulture, studies from Brazil, golf courses in California. And we put in the duration of the trial, which varies from 1 year to, say, with the golf course, 6 years before you might add more biochar. We put the biochar treatment, like 0.1 kilograms per day per head for the cattle, or this much for the plants, or single application in the golf courses. We've got down here the biochar costs, the actual cost of the treatment, varying from a few $100s for the feedlot beef, because you don't feed them very much a day, to $300,000 for the golf courses. And the net benefit, some of them are very great, $12,200 net benefit after we subtract the cost of the biochar from the increase in revenue. Some of them are very low, but we'll address that in a minute. And some are massive, like $3 million, because of the huge water savings on golf courses down in the Palm Springs area of California. So the net benefit per ton of biochar can be quite high, $25,000 per ton in these potato trials, $33,000 per ton in the golf courses. Now, the use return on investment can be 50 times, 10 times like the golf courses, or it might be only 5%. But here we have to emphasize, this is a trial from Brazil with maize. They've grown one crop, they put biochar in, they got their first crop out. They broke even. It actually made a neutral or a positive return, but they can grow 2 more crops in a year. And so the next crops can produce similar returns, which are here, but you have no more cost. So you suddenly get a massive return on your investment. I'm going to go on from that. This is an example of a case study, diagrams, but each case study is organized with a background, methodology, results, impact, key takeaways, and with a table. And it's this table that then has been combined into the upfront table. So the upfront table is like a table of contents, and it's a quick summary of everything. So we got to the last chapter. I'd like to have time to complete this. In this chapter, we're looking at how do you test biochar, simple testing on the farm, divide them into 3 sections here. We have boxes where we give you do-it-yourself methods of measuring things, what you'll need to do, what to do, a formula to calculate, any notes to be aware of. So this is leading to the manual. The guide is preparation for the manual. It's even got our heads around some really good key points that Stephen will sort of bring out for you. But the point is that we have a massive job to translate the massive base of scientific knowledge and some personal wisdom into profitable farming practice. And the manual then forms a basis for training the practice and training the trainers of the practice. We hope it engages farmers in furthering the practice and science. In other words, they become amateur scientists. Farmers can do small trials. In fact, they need to do small trials to optimize their return. Farmers can monitor the outcomes of the biochar field. We want to give all the help we can with how you do that and support to do that. And they can report the results back. The results come back into the manual, into the website, and allow us to keep upgrading it. So we can keep bringing that experience and maintain and communicate the knowledge base and drive this into sort of a viral and massive action. And I suggest we have an annual award for the best translation of knowledge into practice, into communities, into profitability, into sharing, all sorts of different things. So I'm going to hand over now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. Amazing effort. Someone's got to put all this into a presentable format, all of Stephen's information as well, combined in there. So yeah, just really appreciate all the work that you've done. And here's to it going out into the real world and causing some amazing ripple with farmers and other players in the game. So we're running a little bit behind time, but yeah, Thanks so much, Paul. If you can turn your video off now, we'll come to Paul and Stephen at the end in the Q&A session. If you've got any questions regarding Paul's presentation there, just please put them in the Q&A panel. So yeah, thanks, Paul. And now over to Stephen Joseph for his presentation.
Okay, I'll just move everything out of the way.
You can turn your video off, please, Paul.
I'm just going to run through some of the science. I mean, one of the great things about pyrolysis is that it is very different to combustion. And we've tried to bring this out graphically in the first chapter. We're always telling people it's not incineration. It's thermal decomposition of the biomass into a stable carbon, some available carbon for microbes, and then we have a clean gas that comprises hydrogen, methane, CO, and some other high hydrocarbons, and we burn these very cleanly. Okay, so the biochar properties mainly depend on the type of biomass and the conditions of pyrolysis. To make a good quality biochar, the feedstock should be sourced sustainably. And this is something that Ansby's been emphasizing. We don't want timbers from native forests, and we want sustainable resourced biomass. They need to be clean. Yeah, we don't want paint and tars and glues and metals. For pyrolysis, it's best if the moisture contents entering the kiln somewhere between 15 and 20%. Some people run lower, some kilns can run higher, but 15% is a good number to stick for. It should have a fairly uniform size, and they can be easily loaded into the kiln. And one of the things Paul emphasizes, for net drawdown of CO2, the feedstock must come from either fast-growing biomass or from waste and residues that otherwise would decompose. And it's important to understand that we get that during pyrolysis, half the carbon in the biomass is fixed in the biochar, and about half the energy in the biomass is made available. Okay, there's been a lot of talk about the use of wood vinegar. There's 5 producers of wood vinegar in Australia. We just wanted to emphasize that the wood vinegar comes through the condensation of the smoke in the early stages of pyrolysis, and that the condensation leads to a number of different phases. There's a heavy oil and tar phase that must be burnt. There's the raw wood vinegar, and then there's an oily liquid. The oily liquid you can filter and put back in the fields. The raw wood vinegar, it's always best to leave it for a month. But the wood vinegar contains a number of different components, and micron-sized biochar pieces, micron-sized minerals, soluble metals and non-metals, and organic molecules. And that's not understood by people. It's a very complex material. And if you use wood vinegar properly, it has so many uses. And we've talked about that in the chapter. Okay, the second chapter, we really focus on traditional production methods and use. I learned about biochar from working with Indigenous people up in Arnhem Land. I was there as an engineering teacher for 2 years. I want to encourage people to get a copy of this book by Victor Stephenson. It is amazing. I couldn't put it down once I picked it up. But essentially, Aborigines using cultural burning created a large amount of biochar. And what's interesting is that if you look at the soils before Europeans came, some of them had probably carbon content of 10%, and they went down 1, 2, 3 meters in depth. And it's something people don't understand. Once we started introducing hoofed animals and different agricultural practices, we started destroying soil carbon, and we stopped that actually cool burning. This practice is coming back, and I don't have time to talk more, but I just wanted to show you this slide. We've actually done a lot of work in the Murray-Darling region, and what we find is soils that look like the Amazonian dark earth soils. And when we do the analysis, there's very little difference between the structure and composition of the Murray-Darling dark earth soils and those in the Amazon. And what we think is that it's due to the fact that Aborigines made earth ovens. They actually made biochar in pits, but they made it with clay. And I want to come back to clay later on. And they made it with mixed feedstock, grasses, food waste, shells, whatever they had lying around. And they use this for growing different crops. I mean, there's this big controversy. Were Aborigines farmers? Yes, definitely in some regions. So just very briefly, just about all indigenous practices involved mixed feedstocks, low temperature, condensation of the smoke on soil. So they often added soil and ash from the fire. So they were actually what I call biochar organomineral complexes. And these particles, these black particles that they produce, are highly effective at building soil carbon and increasing crop yields. And we talk a little bit about different types of biochar organomineral complexes produced in different ways in traditional societies. This is some nice practices in Vietnam, where they basically put biochar with manure and compost it, and then they put them in furrows and they plant over the furrows. Okay, going on to choosing a biochar reactor to meet your needs. Essentially, what we start off with is say, you know, there's many different names for biochar reactors: stoves, kilns, retorts, and ovens. But all of them must be designed that are for the production of high quality biochar. And so we basically say they need to be easy to load and unload. They need to handle the high heat. They need to burn the released gases without pollution, be safe to operate, and meet local emission standards. Now, having said that, there is a best practice for simple kilns that can be used on farm, and there's a best practice for the more industrial kilns. So we talk about batch and continuous. Batches where you put all your biomass into a kiln, you turn it on, and at the end of anywhere from 1 to 8 hours, biochar is produced. And a continuous device is one where you're putting biomass in all the time and taking biochar all the time. The larger plants that are being built in Australia are mainly continuous, but there are larger batch kilns that are used in areas, especially waste management sites, where you might have a lot of material biomass for part of the year and only a very small amount of material for another part of the year. And they can either be fixed or mobile. Okay, this is just one of the images. Modern biochar plants have a number of different components. They have a materials handling component at the front end. They quite often have a dryer if it's wet fuel. Then there's the pyrolysis reactor. And then they have a heat exchanger of some description to capture the heat. And then they might have emissions control. And then they have devices for post-processing. And we will talk a bit more about that later on. Okay, coming back to this wonderful picture. When biochars are applied to soil, they act as a special type of battery that stores and donates nutrients and electrons to plants and microorganisms, and can increase soil carbon and nitrogen. this was one of the first experiments I did probably 30 years ago. I made a simple battery, biochar on one side, soil on the other side, and I put a voltmeter in between it. And lo and behold, I measured a voltage, and I measured a voltage as a function of time. So what actually happens, it's like a battery. You get a movement of charged particles and a production of electrons. But the thing that we've realized in the last 10 years is that biochar is a very special type of battery. And in actual fact, it's what is known as a microbial fuel cell. In other words, because microbes grow and die inside the biochar, and some microns can accept electrons and some microns can donate electrons, and you can have production of oxygen, and you can have fixation of carbon, is that biochars have these multifunctional roles in both generating electrons and accepting electrons, of storing nutrients and giving out nutrients. And I'll talk a little bit more about what happens when you put these batteries in the root zone of a plant. Okay, so I've just got to, okay. So there's many factors that affect the physical and chemical and hydrological properties of biochar, and we just talk about these. Feedstock, temperature, residence time, particle size, carrier gas, how you actually engineer your biochar reactor. And these days, there's some people that are making biochar at pressures. Okay, just again, most biochars can be used unless they have toxics. One of the things that come out of the meta-analysis is that the most effective biochars are made from either grasses and straws, poultry litter and manures, clean biosolids and bones, all produced at very low temperatures. Now, most people say, well, don't we want to make a high stability carbon? Yes, you can make a high stability carbon, but if you want to actually improve your yields, then make a low temperature biochar. If you want to have high water holding capacity, or in some cases you want to capture certain toxic elements, then make a high temperature biochar. The other thing that we've found is that if you mix your feedstock, like is done in traditional societies, they give you a better biochar than if you use a single feedstock. It's a little bit like agriculture and forestry. If you put a monocrop in, that does more damage to the soil and is more can be affected more easily by pests and be really affected by drought. But if you do mixed plantings or rotation cropping, you actually have a better outcome. The same with biochar. Okay, so we talk a little bit about stable carbon and the fact that at low temperatures, the carbon is not as stable as high temperatures, and that the carbon content is very much a function of feedstock. And this is some data from CSIRO along with other data that we've got from the literature. We also just talk about how do you measure stability. It's a very difficult thing to do. There's a lot of discussion, but essentially it's been widely accepted that if you measure the hydrogen content and the organic carbon content, and you make that as a molecular ratio, then there is a range between 0.4 and 0.7, which basically means the biochar will be stable for over 100 years. We talk quite a bit about water holding capacity, and we give you some interesting results from a whole range of different studies. You can see that maximum water holding capacity is somewhere between 500 and 600, different to crop yields. And if you look at it, some of the best materials are grasses and sugarcane. Surprisingly, wood is not as good as grasses and sugarcane, and this is not widely understood. So what our part of why we've put a lot of data in the Farmer's Guide is really to focus on the fact that most people have this feeling that the best biochars are from wood, and they are definitely not the best biochars for many, many applications. We spend quite a bit of time talking about what happens when plants' roots interact with biochars, and these are some nice pictures that I've taken in my scanning electron microscope and in other electron microscopes that I work on. Essentially, biochar works best when it is around the roots, in the rhizosphere, as the agricultural scientists call it. This middle picture here, I hope you can see my arrow. Here's a root hair. The root hairs are going inside a piece of mineralized biochar, and all these little squiggles here are fungi. And one of the things that we know, high nutrient content biochar made at low temperatures build soil fungal populations, and particularly what they call a buscular mycorrhiza fungi that are inside the root. And this is one of the reasons why biochar works so well if you concentrate it in the rhizosphere. The other thing that is not understood by people, you send your biochar away for analysis and you get a whole lot of data back, which is really interesting. But as soon as you put your biochar in the soil, it changes, and it changes very quickly in some soils, not so quickly in others. So in sandy soils, it doesn't change very quickly, but if you've got a fair bit of clay, and especially if it's an acidic environment, biochar changes very quickly. And in actual fact, biochar's properties improve as it gets older. What happens is that you form these microagglomerates on the surface. More importantly, you actually get colonization of fungi and bacteria inside the pores. And there is a movement of nutrients from inside the biochar to the roots, and from, if there's excess nutrients in the soil itself, they move inside the biochar. And there is this very dynamic situation. Now, the other thing that we know is that the ability to hold on to nutrients is increased as the biochar ages. And that's a really important factor. The other thing we know is that worms will ingest very small pieces of biochar. There'll be movement of biochar through the soil. There'll be all sorts of disturbances, and bits of the biochar will break off. And usually when they break off with these organomineral micro aggregates, and they then are taken into the aggregate structure of the soil. And we know that biochar improves the aggregate structure, and we think the reason is because of this aging process. Talk a little bit about how biochar ages compost. The best way to improve your compost is to add biochar at the very beginning and to spray a little bit of wood vinegar. I don't have time to talk about that, but it's in the paper. I'm going to just skip that. Paul talked about looking at the increase in yields. Paul did a great job of putting all this together from the meta-analyses, and it basically shows that your yield increase really depends on your fertilization as well as the amount of biochar you put in. So you see a wide range of yield increases, you know, anywhere from nothing to 15%. And then in the case of biochar with an inorganic fertilizer, we go from 30 to 70% with an average of 48%. So there's some really nice data presented. And again, the references for most of this work are in the guide. I mean, if people need help, they can contact Ansby and we can help them in terms of formulation, given that their particular soil that they have. One of the amazing things about biochar, it makes phosphorus available. Now, Australia has one of the worst practices of putting too much superphosphate in the soil. So a lot of our soils are full of phosphorus, but it's been locked up. It's not available. Once you put biochar in the soil, because of the changes both to the soil physical, chemical, and microbiological properties, the phosphorus becomes more available. And there's some interesting data that we've put in there about that. Foliar sprays with wood vinegar and water extracts. There's more and more work that's coming out that shows that foliar sprays of wood vinegar applied at very low application rates of between 10 and 50 kilograms a hectare can have a really significant increase in yields. And this is for all sorts of reasons, and I don't have time to go into it. One of the things that we will do in the Farmer's Manual is talk a lot more about these foliar sprays. Some people call them compost teas. Some people call them drenches, where you're actually putting a large amount on the soil as well as onto the leaves. Okay, so what we've tried to do is to give a framework for choosing and enhancing biochars, and I don't have time to go through this, but what we recommend to farmers is look at what your soil constraints are. Look at your environmental constraints, look at your biological constraints, and more importantly, look at your financial constraints. You know, how much can you afford to put on, and what sort of biochar is going to give you the greatest return on investment. And so you just iterate between these different constraints. And again, you know, I probably get a few emails every week asking me to help people to come up with a biochar that's going to work for them. We talk about different methods of enhancing biochars, whether it's been pre-treating the biomass, aging the biochar, or post-treating the biochars by combining it with nutrients and minerals. Very quickly, there's a quick section on making liquid biochars. More and more farmers in Australia are turning to liquid fertilization. And we've been doing a whole lot of experimentation which shows that where you have biochar as part of your liquid fertilization, then you get a greater response than just a straight chemical or an organic fertilization with liquids. One of the other areas that's really important to understand is there is an optimum dose rate for biochar, whether it be a biochar organic product or a biochar chemical product. But the optimum rate for yield increase may not be the same as the optimal rate for profitability or for disease response. And we give some case studies of this in Chapter 9, where greatest yield happened, the greatest profitability happened when the yield wasn't the highest. Disease resistance is a whole nother topic. One of the things that we will do in the manual is to talk a little bit about what we know about how you determine what is the optimum rate for disease resistance. That's a much more tricky area and an area we know less about. Okay, the other thing that we know now is where you put the biochar is as important as how much you put. And we know now that concentrating in the rhizosphere gives you a much greater return on investment and much greater yield than just putting it all through the soil. And we give some examples of this. This is a really interesting study from California where they were planting new vineyards. Again, they're subsoil, basically putting compost and biochar, and they're planting over that. And we gave you an example of how that improves revenue. there's a reference to the full study. We talk about regenerative agriculture, and this really summarizes some of the great things that we've been doing with biochar. One of the areas that we're doing a lot of work in is putting biomass and biochar in trenches, and composting that and using the biochar on the surface to draw down water. And within a context of using different techniques for rotational grazing and adding dung beetles, growing different sorts of crops with foliar sprays so that you minimize the disturbance of the land. These techniques are just, I guess we're really just developing them. We've done probably 5 years of experimentation, and they do seem to work. So we give you some of the data. We haven't put it all in because the manual would have been, the guide would have been enormous, but we will be putting in more details in the manual. Just one of the other things I'd like to say, when you actually put biochar 2 or 3 centimeters thick on the ground, the biochar will draw down water. And one of the things that we think that if you put it in a wide enough area, it can help act as a barrier for the movement of large-scale fires. One of the interesting things that we did was, if you put water, basically you fill the biochar with water. If a fire comes along, what happens is that essentially the fire causes the water to be evaporated from the pores, and it actually quenches the fire because you have a huge volume of steam coming out. We haven't ever had funding to do a large-scale trial, but it's something that we'd like people to try and see if it works. One of the other areas that we've just finished the first lot of pilot testing, biochar can be integrated into solar PV farms. Solar PV farms are carbon positive, they're not carbon negative. But if you actually introduce biochar, you can make them carbon negative. You can build soil carbon through building fungal networks. The other thing that PV does, it actually condenses water from the atmosphere at nighttime. And if you put these trenches underneath the PV panel, what we found is that you can actually capture that water, and it basically stays captured. You don't get evaporation. And that water can then start moving through the soil along mycelia network. So, like I said, we've just done our first study. I'm still analysing the results, and we'll put more detailed information when we go to the manual. And that's my talk, Don.
Thank you, Stephen. Wonderful. All right. So we are only 5 minutes officially till the end of the webinar, but we will get to as many questions as we can. So this would be for you, Paul. If you could turn your video back on now. So are you there, Paul?
Yep.
Yeah. If you could turn your video back on, that'd be great.
I'm unable to now, Don.
Oh, you're unable to? Okay, no worries. Paul, can we use AI to distill the information in the publications so as to create the wisdom to engage more participants? That's from Eric Brocken, our member.
Thanks, Eric. That's exactly what I think we have to do. There's so much data. There's lots of expertise and technologies being developed to extract that data. AI can do that. AI can take in all the outcomes and feedback. In other words, what we do is extract the data, let it help us design the best protocol. So the AI becomes like a doctor for the soil, and then we bring the data back. So that's the element that needs to be added to what I said for the manual. So the AI can learn from all that data, but it needs intelligent supervision. The AI is actually quite intelligent, but it still needs, just like in medicine, you'd still want a doctor involved, even though the AI can probably do better than the doctor in most cases. There would be specific cases where the doctor would get it wrong and needs to be there. So 100% agree with you.
Okay. All right. And one more from Eric. How would we develop the expertise to scale up production/implementation, Paul?
Well, actually, I think AI can play a role there, and we want to do that. We want to mine all of that data, teach the AI how to bring the right thing out for the right soil, the right crop, and design a program. We supervise, oversee that, put the program into practice, measure the outcomes, put it back into the AI.
Okay. All right.
But of course, we have to do it manually. There's lots of wisdom. Stephen has a lot of that, and we can implement projects, but it's a matter of really thinking to get the most out of every single thing we do. So make a trial, design a way to measure the outcomes, design a system to get those outcomes back into, then the AI can learn from that, and we can speed up 10 times as fast as we otherwise would.
Yeah. Okay, no worries. Stephen, any data on pampas grass biochars?
Very little.
There's
lots on there. There's lots of information on miscanthus and hemp, and I'm just trying to think. But look, all grasses usually make good biochar. You know, I think even weeds make great biochar. When I'm making biochar, if I've got lantana and blackberry, which is and privet, which is a real problem around my house, I put it into my biochar machine and make biochar, and it makes great biochar. And I haven't seen a grass that hasn't made a good biochar. It's a function of the structure of the grass and its lignin to cellulose ratio, and that's why on the whole grasses make better biochars than wood, because of those two factors. And look, my favorite grass is bamboo, and especially if you want to use biochar for medicinal purposes. Traditionally in China, Korea, Japan, bamboo was the go-to biochar for medicinal and for feeding to animals. So, and there's a lot of publications on bamboo biochar.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Nupur Kana has asked, when comparing different biochars, was biosolids derived biochar also considered? Stephen.
Yes, we did. The biosolids biochar, we ummed and ahed about how much we put in there. We put a little bit in. Certainly in the meta-analysis, the biochar biosolids were considered. The interesting thing about biosolids, and this is going to feature to some extent in the manual, is that even though biosolids have quite high content of heavy metal compared to what the IBI and the ANSBE Code of Practice says, biosolids biochar is really good at soaking up heavy metals and other organic toxics. The other interesting thing about making biochar from biosolids, of course, is that you get rid of PFAS and hormones and contraceptive pills and God knows what else that's in the biosolids. And you can destroy all those toxic compounds as long as you design your machine to have what they call a thermal oxidizer that runs for 2 seconds at around 850 degrees C. So in theory, one of the best uses for biosolids is to make biochar. Now, there's issues around the present regulatory framework, and in fact, we just had a meeting this morning about all of this. The water industry is trying to convince the regulator that biosolids biochar can be land applied. I think it's going to be an interesting journey, but we will put more information in the manual.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Look, final question, and you both might want to have a go at this one. What are the prospects for adopting biochar creation as a viable practice in reducing fuels in hazard reduction aims of fire services, RFS, etc.? Anyone like to have a go at that one? Who'd like?
Well, I think this is very important, and I think we have to value that. The chance is going to exist best if we value those services. And so we need to create an economy that values the service of, including human labor as well, of doing things like that. Human intensive, localized intensive, but very important to do, and we need to do it. That's my answer.
Okay. Stephen, would you like to have a go
Yeah,
at
yeah,
that?
no, I agree with what Paul said.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about, which we are talking about internally in ANSPI, is the fact that we need to integrate cultural burning with biochar production.
Yeah.
I was in Western Australia talking with an Indigenous group who bought some land, who are training young Indigenous people in cultural burning and other practices. And they're really strongly considering setting up a little biochar plant and integrating that into the cultural burning practices.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. All right. Any final comments from either of you before we knock off?
Just related to that is we live in an economy that is degenerative. Every dollar we spend, every single dollar in almost all cases is degenerating the planet. Case in point, every dollar we spend in food in the US has been shown to cost actually $3. It's $2 of damage, one health and one environmental. It applies to every dollar we spend in the $100 trillion economy. We have to turn this around and get it where every dollar makes a little bit of regeneration on average, so we can pull the planet back from the brink.
Yeah.
And that means changing some systems. For example, the tax system should not tax human labor. It should tax the things that are bad. If you tax the things that are bad, they go away. But in the meantime, you make enough money to run the economy. We should tax financial transactions. Then we can get the wood out of the the environment, turned into biochar and regenerate the planet and stop fires and stop the climate. But we need that change in the financial system. It's part of what we have to work towards.
Yeah. Fantastic, Paul. Any final comments from you, Stephen, before we go? I'll hand it over to Melissa.
Yeah, look, I guess there's two things. One is we're very resource constrained. There's not enough people who have enough long-term experience in biochar equipment and biochar use. ANSPI's doing a great job to try and run workshops. We just ask you, if you have a group and you can raise some money, whether it be through grants or otherwise, and you want to get involved with biochar, please contact us. We run workshops on a regular basis. If you're thinking of actually having a biochar project, before you actually go buy equipment, go and talk to somebody who's actually been involved with either manufacturing equipment or using equipment. I can't say where I went, but I went to see a plant. It's a very, very large plant, but the people who designed it really did not have the experience, and that plant's going to struggle to get up and running. And quite often I'm brought in when people have already built the technology and they're experiencing problems. So before you race off and do things, get some advice. There's quite a few people now that have that experience, both manufacturers, there's a few consultants around, and certainly within ANSPI, there's a group of very knowledgeable people. So please talk to us before you start doing things.
Save a bit of rework later.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you, Paul Taylor, for all that you've done with this Farmer's Guide. And I'll hand it over to Melissa for her closing comments as the chair.
Thank you, Don, for your efforts in this as well. And a huge special thank you again to Paul and Stephen. It's such a valuable resource, and as you can see from the snippets that you've seen, the breadth of information that's within the Farmer's Guide. We would love it if you could share both the Farmer's Guide and the crowdfunding campaign far and wide through all of your social media opportunities. We need to save the planet together. We need to be part of the biochar movement together. We can do this with our networks, and we need to extend those. And with your help, we'll extend the networks, and together we'll pull the planet. And as we said, the biochar industry in Australia alone can mitigate 10% of global carbon emissions. But when it's applied to the soil, it's way more, and it has many more circular, economic, and long-lasting benefits. So thank you so much to the two of you for sharing your wisdom, and Don for being part of the biochar movement from the beginning. We've said enough now, and so I'll hand it back to you to close. Thanks, Don.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. So I'll just share my screen here. That's okay. Are you seeing a turtle or a?
No, we're seeing the Farmer's Guide.
Seeing the Farmer's Guide, good.
Yeah.
All right, so there it is. Just go to our ansbig.org website /farmersguide-2024, and if you're a non-member, you can buy the guide there, and add it to your cart. And if you are a member of Ansbig, just log into your member profile and go across to the menu there where it says Farmer's Guide, and you can download it there at the bottom at no charge. So okay, and as Melissa mentioned, if you would like to share the campaign, or just go and have a look at who has contributed so far. There's a list of the full contributors there. We've hit the 100,000 mark, so that's our first milestone, and we're aiming to get to 300,000 over the next 90 days. So should be good. And there's a video there that you can watch as well. So we'll leave you with that today, and just thank you everyone for your participation and contributions. So until next time, we'll see you later. And Charles.
Green waste and other organic waste is burned or landfilled every year in Australia. This is a waste of a valuable resource. It also causes pollution, including greenhouse gas emissions. But these wasted resources can be turned into a solid form of carbon, biochar. Globally, every year, biochar could sustainably remove billions of tons of excess CO2 already in our atmosphere, while also enhancing food production and regenerating degraded lands. Over 99% of CO2 captured by biomass re-enters our atmosphere as part of the natural carbon cycle. Pyrolyzing wasted plant biomass into biochar intercepts the cycle and converts carbon into a form that is typically stable for centuries to millennia. Biochar is a sustainable and climate-friendly way to transform organic resources into a valuable carbon product and renewable energy for a circular, regenerative, new carbon economy. There are also many proven and emerging markets for biochar that increase profitability and reduce or draw down carbon. Agriculture, horticulture, livestock, cropping, animal feed to improve animal health and reduce methane emissions, soil carbon sequestration, water management and filtration, mine and land rehabilitation, building and construction. With more uses of biochar emerging, the global market is growing rapidly and is forecast to reach almost 4 billion by 2025. Australia is on the cusp of developing a world-leading biochar industry thanks to our testing, technologies, research and high potential resources. ANZBIG's Code of Practice is guiding industry best practice for sustainable production, classification and safe use of biochar. Australia's industry is ready to scale up and create important economic, social and environmental opportunities, becoming a billion-dollar industry by 2030. What is the next step? We need commitment and leadership from corporates, capital, government, entrepreneurs and academics. The Australian Biochar Industry 2030 Roadmap outlines a pathway forward for biochar industry scale-up. The roadmap has the potential to remove existing CO2 from the atmosphere, equivalent to 10 to 15% of Australia's annual emissions, provide 10,000 to 20,000 jobs in regional and rural areas, improve soil health and agricultural productivity, restore degraded lands to their true capacity. You can help put a foot on the brakes for climate change. Here's how. Share this video. Find out more at anzbig.org. Support the 10 key initiatives of the Biochar Industry 2030 Roadmap. Both financial and non-financial resources will help. Contact us to find out more. Show your support by taking the Biochar Pledge as an individual or an organisation, or join the Friends of Biochar community via our website. Join ANZBIG. We look forward to welcoming you.